So, good morning, everybody. My name is Pierre Strosser. I work for a small research and consultancy based in France, and we are supporting a NaturAdapt project with some activities, in particular in preparing some now on the synergies or inter.
Pierre, the quality of the sound is.
You cannot hear?
Well, it comes in and out. So yeah, I don't know what we can do about that. Can you? Okay. Well, I will let you know if you need to repeat. Okay, it's not ideal, but okay, go ahead. Sorry.
No. Okay, sorry for that.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm presenting the work that was done by one of my colleagues, Camille, and probably in parallel to the presentation, answering the activities. The main questions we were trying to address was which opportunities existed in the legal framework by the change in bracket adaptation, and on the other side, biodiversity conservation protection. The presentation will be in 5 steps, briefly reminding the objectives of the study, explaining then what we did, and then sharing a few thoughts and results around 3 questions. The first one is the role or roles that nature can play in relation to adaptation to climate change. The second is about the specific added value nature protection could bring. And the third is to think about ways to bring nature protected areas and nature protections more in the front of climate change adaptation strategies, policies, actions. On the objective, as I mentioned earlier, the idea was to investigate how the current planning frameworks and documents consider the links between biodiversity, in bracket, nature protection and adaptation, and to better capture the roles protected areas can play in climate change adaptation strategies. And what we did was on one side to review studies, planning documents, operational programs on both the biodiversity and the climate change fronts, critically identify the cross-connection links that were made explicit. We had then some interviews with expert planners, decision makers involved in both nature and climate change, from the local to the national scales in France. And then we put together some first result thoughts, and we had a workshop organized with around 35 participants for shaking the results and to go further with recommendations. In the slides here, which I will not describe in detail, is just to illustrate the type of documents we look at from the international to the local levels. some of the abbreviations are not understandable for you. It just shows that we look at international European document and strategies on both climate change / adaptation and biodiversity. We did the same for France, and when we moved at lower scale, we look at documents linked to regional planning, to planning made at the river basin districts, and to more local land use planning and operational programs. Then some of the results or conclusions, quite straightforward for the first one, which was how connections are made between the two policies. When you look at biodiversity focused strategic plans, clearly adaptation to climate change is rarely addressed and well developed. It's more put as a principle, a reminder, and a further justification of some of the actions that are proposed, but with very weak explanations on the connections between the two topics. And when you look at climate change documents, reference to nature, in bracket, whether it's nature, biodiversity, ecosystems, are rather vague, put as principles, and again, rarely well developed to demonstrate how nature can help in operational terms. When you look at both sides, there is limited references to the specific role of protected areas in relation to adaptation to climate change. When you look at the documents, and something that was mentioned in the previous discussions in some of the comments to answer his presentations, the reference that helps to make the connections, they are at least three. I think you all know, are familiar with them. You find references when people deal with ecosystem function and services, and then when there is reference on the role that ecosystems can make in strengthening resilience or address some of the changes in climate that are expected. And you find references to that can help bridging biodiversity and climate change adaptations around the concept of nature-based solutions. Two comments. This is, I'm sure, known by most of you. The first one is that for the documents that we reviewed, there was very unclear definitions of these three concepts in most of the cases, and unclear explanation of what this would imply in operational terms. And the second comment I want to make, if I go back to the slide here, and if you look at the different documents that we reviewed, you realize that most of them, or many of them, have been adopted at the beginning of 2010s up to 2015, some 2018. And this was at the time, let's say 10 years ago, where the three concepts that we list here were just emerging. And we feel that there's some rapid changes with these three concepts, how they're understood, defined. And clearly, we might not be today in the same situations that what these planning documents are translating. A few examples on how nature is more or less explicitly referred to in climate change adaptation strategies. Some are very general, saying that biodiversity needs to be protected because of its intrinsic value. Climate change might threaten biodiversity, so some efforts are to be made to better protect biodiversity. Quite some elements provided in these strategies describe the likely impacts of climate change on biodiversity. Some stress that protections will support climate change adaptations, not always explaining how, and what you find may be more clear and practical is the role that nature or protections can have in enhancing water infiltration, fighting against soil artificialization, something that you find in this climate change adaptation strategy as a transversal objective. And when you look at some of the more operational land use and planning documents, references is made to the role of nature that can enhance the overall resilience of territories, references to some of the ecosystem services that nature can provide, in particular enhancing water retention and reducing flood risk, contributing to a regional to global cooling if you refer to forest areas, and for the planning documents that have a coastal component, the role that nature can play in mitigating coastal submersion risk. The next question we had was, we understand that the connection between nature, biodiversity, and climate change adaptation was not very strong in these planning documents, maybe because some were developed some time ago. So connection is very weak. And then still, does protection enhance the added value of nature? What you can think of are different roles that protection can play as a refuge area, providing right conditions for key habitats, but also for some species to move to these areas. Is climate change negatively impact them elsewhere? A role in terms of knowledge, because within nature protection areas, you are able to monitor biodiversity changes as climate change. And you can also, by looking at differences within your protected areas in terms of altitude, in terms of temperature, in terms of other contextual characteristic, you can sometimes help getting knowledge on what would happen if temperature is likely to increase by 1 to 3 degrees. And then also contributions to the resilience of territories and to some specific ecosystem services. I put here something that was discussed in the workshop I mentioned in terms of water retention, reduction of flood risk, and air cooling. Still, for many protected areas, because of their location, because of the size, their contribution are likely to be limited or marginal. Now you get few, or you get some protected areas close to urban centers. You get some that are located in intensive agricultural areas, but this is not the majority, and as a result, this contribution to ecosystem services are marginal. The last question, how could we bring nature protected areas and their management more central to climate change adaptation strategies policies? The first messages and ideas that emerged from the workshop I mentioned was to work within the community of protected areas managers, first to develop a common advocacy for the role these nature protected areas can play in the context of climate change adaptations, advocacy that could take place at different scales. The second was to bring the expertise on ecology, on ecosystem functioning, on services delivered of managers to the planning processes at different scales, making sure that nature is well considered when people work on climate change adaptation strategies. And the third was to share or to support the sharing of practices demonstrated, so they would have some evidence showing how nature protected areas or nature more generally can contribute to the resilience and climate change adaptation. The second was an issue on making more explicit integration of nature protected areas in local planning processes and documents. This would require that managers of these protected areas participate more visibly in territorial planning processes that require still some time, some resources, time to be present. The second was to find mechanisms to share knowledge with other local stakeholders, local authorities about the importance of biodiversity and nature protection areas. So raising the nature literacy of people that are around us and that are leading these planning processes. And as I said earlier, clearly requiring more resources to be part of these processes, and then to also at a later stage strengthen the services that NPA can deliver for the resilience of territory. In some cases, this might require the way to look at protection. First, in the type of knowledge that we collect within nature protected areas or connected to nature protected areas, widening the monitoring, not only to look at the main focus of our protection, but also trying to capture other changes that are taking place because of some changes in climate, and then also monitoring some of the ecosystem services that our protected areas deliver. And the second part was about what to protect and where to protect, clearly moving outside the traditional natural protected areas, looking more at connected corridors, in particular in putting some efforts so the management of these corridors connected to our protected areas are adapted and facilitate connections of species in particular. I stop here. I hope that you could at least understand a bit of what I presented. Sorry for the bad connection.